I don't really believe in ghosts, but there was this one time. It was my second year of university. I had just moved into halls with my friend Joe, and there were these really weird rules. For example, if it was your birthday, then you could stay up past curfew. That was rule no. 1. If it was your birthday, you could stay out as late as you wanted. Rule no. 2. If you were on kitchen duty, you didn't have to cook because you were off the hook. So for my birthday last year, I decided that I was gonna stay up until 6 in the morning because I can. But also I made Joe do all the cooking. He made us some sweet spaghetti carbonara. We were just having a good time. It was nice. And then at around 3 a.m., we're in our room playing FIFA and suddenly the door bursts open and it was our Ra. She was stood there with her arms crossed and she said, "Right, I'm gonna give you a warning because according to the nose meter, you're at the legal limit for no's. If you make any more no's, I'm gonna have to fine you." And I was like, "Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, it won't happen again." Then she slammed the door behind her and we heard her footsteps going down the hallway. But about an hour later, the door bursts open again and it was our Ra again. And she said, "Right, I'm gonna give you another warning because you're over the nose limit again." And I was like, "Oh, shit." Then she slammed the door behind her again and we heard her footsteps going down the hallway again. But within a couple minutes, the door burst open for the third time and it was our Ra again. And she said, "Right, I'm gonna give you a warning because you're over the nose limit again." And I was like, "What?" So we went and looked through the little window that you have on your door and we saw her standing right outside our door. Like she wasn't even in the corridor, she was literally stood directly outside our door with her arms crossed. And then she started banging on the door and shouting, "Right, I'm gonna give you a warning because you're over the nose limit again," but she wasn't making any noise. Like she was literally just standing there silent. But then suddenly, a whole floor started shaking and our door started to shake. And we were like, "Whoa." And then we saw the bottom of her door slowly start opening. Like she had opened it slightly, but not from inside the room, from underneath the door. And then suddenly she screamed and we heard a loud bang and then everything went silent. So me and Joe, we just looked at each other and we were like, "Do we call security?" And then we both just decided, "Nah, let's just go to sleep." But then a couple hours later, so now it's like 5 a.m., we hear a knock on the door and we're like, "Who could that be?" Because all the other RAs were stood outside our door, so they would know not to come to our door. So we opened the door and it was just our Ra again. And she said, "Right, I'm gonna give you a warning because you're over the nose limit." And I was like, "I told you guys to stop banging on the door like an hour ago." And she said, "Yeah, but I only just got back from my shift. You guys have been so unbelievably loud. You need to keep it down." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, it won't happen again." And she said, "Good. Oh, and happy birthday." Then she walked away and closed the door. And I was like, "Happy birthday to me." So we went back to our room, and we decided that we weren't gonna play FIFA anymore and instead we were gonna play some Minecraft. And then we were just playing and we were like, "Yeah, this is actually quite fun." Suddenly we heard banging on the door again. So we looked through the window and we saw it was our Ra again. And she was banging on the door and she said, "Right, I'm gonna give you a warning because you're over the nose limit." And we were like, "She's mental." So we ignored her and we carried on playing our game. And then a few hours later, we woke up and we were like, "Wow, that was crazy. That Ra was proper mental. Do you think she's gonna fine us?" And then suddenly we heard banging on the door and we were like, "Oh, God, here we go again." So we looked through the window and it wasn't our Ra. It was actually a different Ra. And he said, "Hey, guys, you okay? Everything alright in there?" And I was like, Yeah, we're good, mate." He said, "Okay, cool. Just checking because earlier this morning, I was doing my rounds and I checked in all the rooms to see if everyone was okay and if they were being quiet and everything. But I couldn't get into your room because it was locked and the door wouldn't open." And then I turned to Joe and I was like, "Wait, what? What do you mean?" And then he looked at me with a confused expression and he said, "What do you mean? I unlocked the door, didn't I?" And then I was like, "No, dude, the door was locked. I tried to unlock it with my key card, but it wouldn't open. So I had to go and get the maintenance guy to come and open it. But when he opened it, no one was in the room. All of your stuff was there, but you were gone. Where were you?" And I was like, what? So I'll never forget this moment. I turned to Joe and I said, where were you last night? And he looked at me with a confused expression again, and he said, I was in our room. We were playing FIFA, and I said, well, I wasn't in our room. I was in our room last night. And then we started arguing back and forth. We were like, I wasn't in our room last night. I was in our room last night. And then we just stopped and we looked at each other and we were like, oh my god, oh my god. Then we started laughing and we were like, this is gonna be one of those stories that we tell at Christmas when we were old and gray. But then we still had to find out where Joe was last night because he wasn't in the room and I was in the room. So we went and checked all the CCTV footage and it turns out Joe left the room at around 12:30 a.m. and he went to some girl's room. And I was like, you dirty dog. Then he came back at around 4 a.m. and I was still in bed sleeping. So Joe's version of events was that he left a room at around midnight and he went to a girl's room and they were just chilling and they were just watching Netflix and stuff. And then at around 4 a.m., he came back to the room. He woke me up and he said, come on, man, let's go to this party in Hall 2. And I said, nah, I'm good, you go. And then he said, okay, cool, yeah, I'm just gonna change my clothes real quick. And then he came back and he said, right, I've changed my clothes, you sure you don't wanna come? And I was like, yeah, I'm sure, man, have fun. And then he left the room and then he came back at around 5:30 a.m. And I was like, why did you come back? The party's finished. And he said, I just couldn't find anyone else to go home with. So I thought I might as well just come back here. And then we woke up at around 7 a.m. together. But the thing is, when we checked the CCTV footage, it turns out Joe left the room at around midnight, went to a girl's room, then came back at 4 a.m. But then he left again at 4:30 a.m., which was before I even woke up. So we don't know where he went. And then he came back at around 5:30 a.m. So we don't know what happened between 4:30 a.m. and 5:30 a.m. And then that same day after all that had happened, we had our birthday dinner with our friends and we were telling them all the stories and everything. And then suddenly our Raw sat down at our table and she said, happy birthday, and I was like, thanks. And then she said, I just wanted to apologize for earlier. I was really rude and I shouldn't have kept coming to your door and stuff. I'm really sorry. And I was like, oh, no, it's all good. It was quite funny. It was just a bit of a shock. And then she said, actually, and she looked down at her phone and she said, can I ask you something? And I was like, yeah, sure. And she said, did you do anything suspicious last night? Like, did you steal anything or break anything? And I was like, no. Why would you ask? And she said, because someone reported that their laptop had gone missing last night and they think it might have been stolen. It was a black laptop, right? And it was taken sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. And it makes sense because the window was open and the laptop was just sitting on the desk. And I was like, oh, wait, hold on, because I had taken my laptop with me to Joe's room. It wasn't in my room, and I was like, that's probably why I couldn't get in your room. You took the laptop with you. And she said, oh, okay, cool. Thanks for your help. And then she walked away. But then after she'd walked away, I turned to Joe and I was like, where did you put my laptop? And he was like, what? And then I explained to him everything that the Ra had just said, and he was like, oh, God. Then we spent the next 3 hours looking for that laptop until we eventually found it under his bed. It was literally just sitting there, so I don't know if you believe in ghosts, but I think our halls may have been haunted because it was the weirdest thing ever.